Number 1. The Marduk Prophecy. In the ruins of Nineveh, in the library of Ashurbanipal, archaeologists recovered a clay tablet covered in wedge-shaped script. More copies turned up at Ashur, and the German scholar Riekle Borger published the definitive edition in 1971. What he found was unlike almost anything else in Mesopotamian literature. Most Babylonian omen texts are impersonal lists. If a lamb is born with 2 heads, then the king should fear his advisors. Cold, conditional, cataloged in series. This tablet is different. It speaks in the first person, and the person speaking is the god Marduk himself. Marduk describes leaving Babylon 3 times. He goes to the land of Hatti. He goes to Assyria. He goes to Elam. And here is the thing. Each of those journeys corresponds to a real, documented, humiliating event. Around 1595 BCE, the Hittite king Mursili I sacked Babylon and carried off Marduk's cult statue. Around 1225 BCE, the Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta I took the city and took the statue again. And around 1155 BCE, the Elamites dragged that same statue away to Susa as the Kassite dynasty collapsed. Marduk does not describe these as defeats. He calls himself a merchant traveling with his goods, turning 3 national catastrophes into business trips. Then comes the prediction. A king will arise in Babylon. He will bring the god home. He will restore the temples, and the land will prosper. Almost every scholar who has read the text agrees on who that king is. Nebuchadnezzar I, who ruled from about 1125 to 1104 BCE. He marched into Elam in the burning heat of the month of Tammuz, when his own inscriptions say, "The ground scorched and the axes burned like fire." He defeated the Elamite king at the river Uliah, and he brought the statue back. That statue was not decoration. Babylonian kingship was legally conferred at the New Year festival, when the king took the hand of Bel. No statue, no ceremony, and arguably no legitimate king at all. So the prophecy predicted the one thing its author had already watched happen. Scholars call this a prophecy after the event, and it is not alone. A dynastic prophecy from the same tradition runs accurately through Assyrian, Persian, and Macedonian rule, then dissolves into vagueness exactly where its author's knowledge stopped, which raises an uncomfortable question for everything that follows. If a state could manufacture a fulfilled prophecy this cleanly, how would we ever spot the difference? Number 2, the Oracle of the Potter. In Egypt, a very different kind of text survives on 3 main papyri. 2 are in Vienna. 1 came from the rubbish mounds of Oxyrhynchus. Ludwig Konen's reconstruction, from 1968 onward, is still the standard. The surviving copies date from the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, but the composition is much older, probably the 2nd century BCE, with an Egyptian version in Demotic behind the Greek. The story is strange. A potter is working on the island of the sun god. He is arrested and dragged before a king named Amenhotep. The local people smash his pottery. And then, standing among the broken vessels, he delivers a prophecy and dies. He speaks about the girdle wearers. That is a coded term every Egyptian reader would have understood. It means the Greeks, the Ptolemaic rulers sitting in Alexandria, and he aligns them with Seth, the god of disorder. The city by the sea will be emptied. Alexandria, the greatest Greek city in the world, home to the library and the museum and the lighthouse, will become a place where fishermen spread out their nets to dry. Memphis will be restored as the true capital, and a king will come from the sun to put the world back in order. Between 207 and 186 BCE, Upper Egypt had broken away entirely under 2 native pharaohs, while the Ptolemaic dynasty tore itself apart. So this is a text written by the losing side. And yet, Alexandria was badly damaged under the Emperor Aurelian in 272 CE. It was besieged for 8 months by Diocletian in 297 and 298 CE. Then the ground itself gave way. Earthquakes in 365 CE and again in 1303 CE dropped the royal quarter into the harbor. Since 1992, the underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio has mapped what is down there. The island of Antirrhodus, structures of the Ptolemaic palace, statues and columns on the seabed. Today, fishing boats work directly above the Ptolemaic waterfront. The mechanism here is not mysterious. Take real grievance, project it backwards into a golden age, and write the collapse you want as a prophecy you received. Scholars call this resistance literature. Under occupation, prophecy was the only form of dissent that could be written down safely. But there is a residue that will not dissolve. In the 2nd century BCE, nothing whatsoever required the largest Greek city on earth to end up underwater. Number 3. Jesus ben Ananias and the cry over Jerusalem. Everything we know about this man comes from one source. Flavius Josephus, Book 6 of the Jewish War. Josephus was a Jewish priest and a commander in Galilee who surrendered to the Romans at Jotapata, then wrote his history from inside the camp of the emperor who had crushed his own people. The man he describes is nobody. Jesus, son of Ananias, described with a Greek word meaning an untrained man, a rustic. He began in 62 CE at the Feast of Tabernacles. Jerusalem was at peace and prosperous. The temple was standing, and the pilgrim crowds were enormous. And into that, this man started shouting, "A voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the holy house, a voice against the bridegroom and the bride, a voice against this whole people." Those were the words. He never varied them. The leading citizens beat him. It did not stop. They handed him to the Roman procurator, Lucius Albinus, who had him flogged until his bones showed. And here is the detail Josephus lingers on. Under the scourge, the man did not plead, did not weep, and did not answer a single question. He repeated the same lament. Albinus concluded he was insane and released him. He kept going for 7 years and 5 months, loudest at festivals. He never cursed the people who struck him, and never thanked the people who fed him. Then, in 70 CE, with Titus and 4 legions around the walls, he was walking the fortifications, repeating the cry. That day he added something new. Woe to me also. A stone from a Roman siege engine struck him in that instant, and killed him. Josephus describes those engines elsewhere. They threw stones of about a talent in weight, and the watchmen learned to shout a warning when they saw the white stone coming. Excavations in Jerusalem have since uncovered concentrations of exactly those limestone ballista balls. Now, the case against. Josephus wrote after the fact, for Flavian patrons, and badly needed the destruction of Jerusalem to look divinely fated rather than politically chosen. He surrounds the story with portents. A comet shaped like a sword hanging over the city for a year. A brass gate so heavy it took 20 men to close, swinging open by itself at midnight, and there is an obvious model. Jeremiah stood in the same courts, delivering the same warning before the Babylonians came in 586 BCE. This man may have been performing a role that already existed. What resists all of that is the duration, the setting, and the ending. 7 years of public performance in a peaceful city, and a death that matched the words exactly. Number 4. The Prophecy of Neferti. The previous man predicted the fate of a city. This next text does something far harder. It names a king. The main manuscript is Papyrus Hermitage 1116b in St. Petersburg, copied around 1450 BCE. We also have it on writing boards in London and Cairo, and on around 20 pottery fragments from the workers' village at Deir el-Medina. That last detail matters. This was a school text. copied out for practice for centuries. The frame is charming. King Sneferu of the 4th dynasty, who ruled around 2613 to 2589 BCE, is bored. He asks his court for entertainment, and they bring him a lector priest named Neferti from the temple of Bastet at Bubastis. Then the king does something no pharaoh is ever shown doing. He picks up the palette and writes the prophecy down himself. What Neferti describes is Egypt turned upside down. The river so low a man can walk across it. The sun veiled. Asiatics pouring into the delta. The beggar growing rich, and a man's own slave becoming his master. Then the rescue arrives, with a name attached. A king will come from the south. Ameni the Justified. The son of a woman of Ta Seti, a child of Upper Egypt. Ameni is a well-attested short form of Amenemhat. Amenemhat I founded the 12th dynasty around 1991 BCE. He was not royal. His father Senusret was a commoner, and Ta Seti is the province his family came from. The text goes further. It says, "This king will build the walls of the ruler to keep the Asiatics out." And Amenemhat I did build precisely such a fortification chain in the eastern delta. So the scholarly consensus is straightforward. The text was written under Amenemhat I, or very shortly after, to make a man with no bloodline look like the answer to a 500-year-old prediction. The chaos Neferti foresees is a portrait of the first intermediate period, roughly 2181 to 2055 BCE, which had already ended, and that chaos was real. Fakhri Hassan's work on Fayum lake levels and Nile sediment studies both point to catastrophic flood failure at the end of the Old Kingdom, inside a global aridification episode around 2200 BCE. Egypt produced a whole literature of this kind, including the instruction of Amenemhat, in which the dead king speaks to his son and implies he was murdered in a palace conspiracy, which explains everything. A usurper who was assassinated needed his dynasty legitimized harder than anyone. Egyptian kingship rested on Mat, order restored out of chaos. Manufacture the chaos, and a coup becomes cosmic repair. Number 5. The 12 Vultures of Romulus. Egypt's forecast named a man. Rome's named a deadline. The story is one of the oldest in Roman memory. Romulus and Remus could not agree who would found the city, so they took the augury. Remus watched from the Aventine Hill and saw 6 vultures. Romulus watched from the Palatine and saw 12. Livy, Plutarch, and Dionysius of Halicarnassus all tell it. Plutarch even explains why vultures. They were rare, they did not damage crops or attack other birds, and they fed only on the already dead. In augural terms, the cleanest possible sign. Now, the arithmetic. Varro calculated Rome's foundation to the 21st of April, 753 BCE, and Romans counted their years from that date. Centuries later, a writer named Censorinus, in a work published in 238 CE, records an interpretation credited to an augur called Vedius. Each vulture was 100 years. 12 birds, 12 centuries. 753 BCE plus 1200 years lands on 447 CE. Consider what falls inside that window. Alaric and the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 CE, the first time the city had fallen to a foreign enemy in 800 years. Attila brought the Huns into Italy in 452 CE. Genseric and the Vandals sacked Rome for 14 days in June of 455 CE. And then, on the 4th of September, 476 CE, a Germanic commander named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor at Ravenna. That emperor's name was Romulus Augustulus. The first king of Rome was Romulus. The last emperor of the West was Little Romulus. The collapse that followed was physical, not symbolic. Rome had held perhaps 1 million people at its peak. By the 6th century, it held around 30,000, because during the Gothic Wars, the king Vitiges cut the aqueducts, and a city of 1 million people cannot exist without imported water. So, is the prophecy real? Almost certainly not. The 100 years per bird reading is only attested centuries after the founding legend, and it surfaces precisely when Rome was already frightened. 12 is an augural constant across Italic religion, so a 1200-year span is an artifact of the number itself. And 476 is not 447. That is a 29-year miss. There is a bigger objection still. The Eastern Roman Empire, whose citizens called themselves Romans, ran on until 1453 CE. But here is what makes it matter anyway. The Romans were counting. In the 5th century, educated men knew the number and knew how close it was. A prophecy does not have to be true to change how a civilization behaves while it waits. Number 6. The Völuspá and the Fimbulwinter. The poem called Völuspá, the Prophecy of the Seeress, survives in the Codex Regius, written around 1270 CE, and in a second copy from about 1310 CE. Bishop Brynjolfur Sveinsson rediscovered it in Iceland in 1643. The speaker is a Völva, a seeress. Odin has raised her from the dead to answer questions about how the world began and how it ends. And in her account of the ending, there is a specific and unusual detail. Fimbulwinter, the mighty winter. 3 winters in a row with no summer between them. Wars everywhere. Brothers killing brothers. Every obligation between people breaking down. The sun turns black. Land sinks into the sea. Bright stars fall out of the sky. Now hold that image and go to the year 536 CE. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave its light without brightness, like the moon, for that entire year. Cassiodorus in Italy described a bluish sun, a moon with no splendor, and crops chilled through the middle of summer by a persistent dry fog. Michael the Syrian and John of Ephesus recorded the same dimming from the eastern Mediterranean. Then the ice confirmed it. Sulfate spikes in Greenland ice cores mark enormous volcanic eruptions in 536 and again in 540 CE. In 2015, Michael Sigel and colleagues published a redating of the ice core chronology in the journal Nature that locked those dates down. In 2016, Ulf Bunken and colleagues used tree rings from the Alps and the Altai to define the late antique Little Ice Age, running from about 536 to 660 CE. It was the coldest decade in the Northern Hemisphere in roughly 2,000 years, and Scandinavia is not a forgiving place to lose your summers. In 2012, Bo Grassland and Neil Price argued in the journal Antiquity that up to half the population of Scandinavia may have died. Farms across upland were abandoned and never reoccupied. Gold deposition into bogs spikes in the mid-6th century, which looks a great deal like desperate sacrifice. And at Sandby Borg, a ring fort on the island of Öland, at least 26 people were killed in their houses and simply left there. Nobody buried them. For generations, people stayed away. The obvious objection is the gap. 700 years separate 536 CE from the manuscript, which means 20 or more generations of oral transmission. And apocalyptic winters turn up across Indo-European mythology generally, so the motif may be far older than the event. What survives that objection is the specificity, not a cold winter. 3 summers that did not arrive. That is an unusual thing to invent, and we can now date exactly such an event to the year. Number 7. The Books of Chilam Balam. In the Yucatan Peninsula, somewhere between 9 and 18 manuscripts survive, written in the Yucatec Maya language using the Latin alphabet. They are named for the towns that kept them: Chumayel, Tidzimin, Mani, Kawa, Ixil, Tusik. Chilam Balam means jaguar priest. He was reportedly a real priest at Mani, who prophesied before the Spanish arrived. The most quoted manuscript, the Chumayel, was copied out by Juan José Hoyle in 1782. The contents are a jumble by design, with calendar tables, medical recipes, astrology, chronicles, and Christian material all sitting together. To understand the prophecy, you need the unit of time. The Katun is 20 tons, roughly 19 and 3/4 solar years, and each is named for the day it ends on. 13 Katuns make a cycle of about 256 years, after which the names come round again. And the Maya expectation was that when the name returned, the character of the time returned with it. History was not a line. It rhymed. 2 Katuns carry the arrival material. Bearded men will come from the east. A new religion will arrive. A raised wooden standard will come into the land, which almost every reader takes to mean the cross. Hernandez de Cordoba reached the Yucatan coast in 1517, and Cortez landed at Cozumel in 1519. Katun 11, Ahau in the Maya count, runs roughly from 1520 to 1539, and the Montejo conquest of Yucatan ran from 1527 to 1546. That is an uncomfortably good fit, and there is an equally uncomfortable problem. Every single surviving manuscript is post-conquest. They are written in an alphabet the Franciscans introduced after 1545, which means every one of them was written down after the bearded men had already arrived. And the reason we have nothing earlier is a man named Diego de Landa. In July of 1562, at Mani, Landa burned the Maya books. By his own account, 27 bark paper volumes. He later wrote an account of Maya writing while under investigation for his conduct, which leaves us relying on the arsonist for the description of the library. 4 pre-conquest Maya codices survive in the entire world, so the skeptical reading is strong. Writing down "we were warned" after the catastrophe makes the unbearable intelligible. And the missionaries had every reason to encourage the idea that their arrival had been foretold. But Katun prophecy itself is demonstrably pre-contact. The Katun wheels appear in the Dresden Codex, which nobody wrote after 1519. The format is genuine, even if the fit is not. Number 8. The Bahman Yasht. In Iran, the surviving Zoroastrian apocalypse is called the Zand-i-Wahman Yasin. It comes down to us in Middle Persian, in manuscripts from the 14th century CE onward, presenting itself as a commentary on a lost and much older Avestan scripture. The vision at its heart is a tree with 4 branches, each made of a different metal. Gold, silver, steel, and then the last one, made of mixed iron. Each branch is an age. Gold is the reign of Zoroaster's royal patron Vishtaspa. Silver is Ardashir. Steel is Khosrow I, the great reforming Sasanian king. And then the mixed Iron Age arrives, and the text describes invaders with disheveled hair and black banners. Zoroastrian tradition read that as the Arab conquest. The Sasanian Empire lost at Al-Qadisiyah around 636 CE, lost again at Nahavand, and ended with the death of Yazdegerd III at Merv in 651 CE. The decline markers are specific. Contracts broken, the sun's light diminished, crops failing, reverence for fire abandoned. Then comes the resolution, with the savior figure Seotiant, a final battle, and the renewal of the world. Now look at that 4-metal scheme again, because you have seen it before. In the book of Daniel, chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar dreams of an enormous statue with a head of gold, a chest of silver, a belly of bronze, and feet of iron mixed with clay. 4 metals, 4 kingdoms, degenerating in the same order, and a third time in Hesiod, writing in Greece around 700 BCE, whose 5 ages of humanity run gold, silver, bronze, heroic, and iron. Nobody has settled who borrowed from whom. Some Iranists argue the scheme is originally Iranian and reached the Hebrew text during the Persian period. Others treat it as a shared Near Eastern commonplace. Seretti also identified Sasanian and Islamic period layers inside the surviving Pahlavi text, which means the manuscript we read has been updated, though Mary Boyce argued that genuinely ancient Avestan eschatology sits underneath the later editing. The context explains the mood. The Sasanian Empire had just fought a ruinous war with Byzantium from 602 to 628 CE. Plague swept through. The Mesopotamian canal system flooded in the 620s and was never fully repaired. So this text is less a prediction than an explanation. It gives a defeated priesthood a story in which the defeat was scheduled, and therefore temporary. Number 9. The War Scroll of Qumran. In 1947, Bedouin shepherds of the Ta'amire tribe found scrolls in a cave above the Dead Sea. One is cataloged as 1QM, the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. It is about 2.9 meters long, with 19 surviving columns. Eliezer Sukenik of the Hebrew University bought it in late 1947, and his son Yigael Yadin, a general as well as an archaeologist, published the definitive study in 1962. The handwriting dates the copy to around the turn of the 1st century, and what it contains is not a vision. It is a plan. The scroll lays out a 40-year war, 6 years of preparation, then campaigns nation by nation against the Chilam of Ashur, against Edom, Moab, Ammon, and Philistia, and against Jewish opponents the sect calls violators of the covenant. Sabbatical years are built into the schedule, because even the apocalypse must respect the calendar. Chilam almost certainly means the Romans. Another Qumran text describes the Kittim as an army that sacrifices to its own standards, an unmistakable description of Roman legionary practice. The military detail is astonishing. Shield dimensions, spears of 7 cubits including the blade, the ratio of cavalry to infantry, trumpets inscribed with fixed slogans, each call triggering a named maneuver, banners inscribed differently for thousands, hundreds, 50s and 10s. The formations resemble Roman practice, with skirmishers, reserve lines, and fresh troops rotated through the front. There is even a religious engineering problem solved inside the plan. The priests direct the battle with trumpets, but may not enter the killing zone because contact with corpses would defile them. Above all of it, the Archangel Michael leads the heavenly host against Belial, and the outcome is fixed in advance. 3 lots fall to the sons of light, 3 to the sons of darkness, and in the 7th lot, God intervenes personally and settles it. Roland de Vaux excavated Qumran in the 1950s. The settlement was destroyed by fire and occupied by Roman troops around 68 CE during the First Jewish Revolt. So here is what happened. A community wrote a 40-year operational plan for defeating the Romans, complete with trumpet inscriptions and shield measurements, hid it in a jar in a cliff, and was wiped out by the Romans within a few decades. The honest reading is that this was never a forecast. It was liturgy in military costume, a way of holding a sect together under pressure. And it shows you what prophecy looks like when it is written with the confidence of an operations order, and what reality does with that confidence. Number 10. The Dresden Codex Venus Table. Everything so far has been about interpretation. This one is about arithmetic, and it is the only case on this list that unambiguously works. The Dresden Codex is one of only 4 surviving pre-conquest Maya books. It sits in the Saxon State Library, bought in Vienna in 1739. It is 39 leaves of bark paper coated in lime plaster, folding out like a screen to about 3.5 meters. And it was probably produced in the 11th or 12th century CE from much older classic period material. Pages 24 and 46 through 50 contain the Venus table, tracking the synodic cycle of Venus, the time the planet takes to return to the same position relative to the Sun as seen from Earth. The Maya used a value of 584 days. The modern measured figure is 583.92 days. Then they exploited a coincidence. 5 Venus cycles come to 2,920 days. 8. Maya years of 365 days come to exactly the same number. So the table locks Venus and the calendar together in an 8-year block that repeats. But they knew about the small error. So the table includes corrections, subtracting 4 days and 8 days at set intervals to keep the count aligned across centuries. That is not mysticism. That is deliberate error correction. Floyd Lounsbury worked out the mechanics in the 1980s, and in 2016, Gerardo Aldana argued the corrections reflect real observational reform rather than number play. The Maya did not treat this as neutral information. The first appearance of Venus was dangerous. The artwork shows a Venus deity hurling a spear, with a different victim at each station of the cycle. Linda Shaley and David Friedel argued that classic Maya warfare clusters around Venus events, the so-called Star Wars. That correlation has been challenged statistically, but the intent in the artwork is not in doubt. The same codex carries eclipse tables, built on a cycle of 135 lunar months. And yes, this is the book behind the 2012 panic. The long count date. 13.0.0.0.0 falls on the 21st of December, 2012, but no codex says anything about destruction on that date. The only monument that mentions it is Monument 6 from Tortuguero, and its text is damaged. A second reference, found at La Corona, uses the date for ordinary royal commemoration. Here's the lesson worth carrying. This prophecy works because the future it predicts is a physical cycle. Predicting a planet is engineering. Predicting a person is interpretation. Number 11. The 70 Weeks of Daniel. Which brings us to the most argued over calculation in the ancient world. Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 to 27, is set during the Babylonian exile. It promises 70 weeks. 77s, generally read as 490 years, running from a decree to restore Jerusalem until an anointed one is cut off and the city and sanctuary are destroyed. The period is subdivided oddly. 7 weeks, then 62 weeks, then one final week in which sacrifice stops and an abomination is set up in the temple. The book itself is a strange object. It is bilingual, part Hebrew and part Aramaic, which tells you it was assembled rather than written in one sitting. Traditional dating puts it in the 6th century BCE. Critical scholarship puts the visions around 165 BCE, and the argument for the later date is hard to answer. Chapters 10 and 11 track Hellenistic politics with extraordinary accuracy, court by court and marriage by marriage, right up to the reign of Antiochus IV. And then, at the moment of his death, the text gets it wrong. Antiochus desecrated the temple in December of 167 BCE, setting up an altar to Olympian Zeus and banning circumcision and Sabbath observance. That is the abomination. The Maccabean revolt began that same year, and Judas Maccabeus rededicated the temple in December of 164 BCE. Antiochus died later that year in Persia. Daniel chapter 11 describes a different death. A philosopher named Porphyry made exactly this argument in the 3rd century CE. We know his reasoning only because Jerome quoted it in order to argue against it. The competing reading counts forward to the 1st century CE. Start from a Persian decree, either 458 or 445 BCE. Add the 490 years, and you land in the lifetime of Jesus. Critics point out that if you choose your own year length and your own starting decree, you can land anywhere you like. And Jerusalem was destroyed. Titus burned the temple in 70 CE, which the Messianic reading takes as the fulfillment. There is a further wrinkle. Josephus says the Jewish revolutionaries were driven partly by an ambiguous oracle promising a world ruler out of Judea, and the Romans later claimed it had meant Vespasian. 8 copies of Daniel were found at Qumran, one dated by handwriting to around 125 BCE, close enough to the proposed composition date to make everyone slightly uncomfortable. The real finding here is structural. A numerical prophecy with an undefined starting point cannot be disproved, because the person doing the calculation chooses the anchor. That is precisely why it has never stopped being recalculated. So how do specialists actually test these texts? The tools are more concrete than you might expect. The first is the degradation test. Find the point where accurate detail turns vague, and you have probably found the moment the author was writing in. It works on the Babylonian dynastic prophecy, on Daniel chapter 11, and on the mixed iron branch of the Bahman Yasht. The second is manuscript distance. Almost nothing here survives in an original. We read copies made centuries later, and every act of recopying is an opportunity for quiet updating. The third is language. Daniel's Hebrew and Aramaic split, or the Greek layer sitting over a lost Egyptian original, both leave fingerprints. Then there are the physical methods. Handwriting analysis, carbon dating of the Qumran materials, ice core chronology, which is what allowed the Norse winter to be checked against a real year. Multispectral imaging is now recovering text from fragments that looked blank, and the field polices itself, sometimes painfully. In 2020, the Dead Sea Scroll fragments held by the Museum of the Bible were shown to be modern forgeries. The toolkit matters because it separates two very different statements. We cannot explain this, and we have not checked this. There is a second kind of test, and it is uncomfortable in a different way. Ask how often ancient cities were destroyed. Over a span of 1,000 years, the answer approaches all of them. Siege warfare was routine. Sacking was policy. So a prophecy that a great city will fall is not a glimpse of the future. It is a bet on the most likely outcome available. Then consider what survived. Failed prophecies were not copied, and copying was the only way a text stayed alive. The archive we inherited has already been filtered to remove the misses. Vagueness works as insurance. The less specific a claim, the wider the range of events that can satisfy it. An undefined starting date, as in the 70 weeks, removes the possibility of failure entirely. Named individuals are the rare exception, which is why the Egyptian text naming Ameni is the diagnostic case. When a prophecy names a man, it is usually because the man was already on the throne, and some of these predictions helped cause the thing they described. Romans in the 5th century knew their deadline. An oracle helped start a war that ended with the temple burning, and the winners then claimed it had meant them all along. The odds explain most of this list. Most is doing real work in that sentence. None of that means ancient people could not predict anything. They could, and precisely, whenever physics allowed it. The Venus table is the clearest case, accurate to a fraction of a day across centuries. Eclipses were tracked through the Saros cycle of 18 years and 11 days, which lets you forecast the next one from the last. Herodotus credits Thales of Miletus with predicting the solar eclipse of 585 BCE, which stopped a battle between the Medes and the Lydians in the middle of the fighting. Babylonian scribes kept astronomical diaries for centuries, building a data set no individual could hold in memory. Egyptian officials predicted the Nile flood from the rising of Sothis, the star we call Sirius, and measured the river with nilometers so taxes could be set before the harvest. That is the distinction that organizes this entire subject. Cyclical natural systems are predictable. Human decisions are not, which is exactly why political prophecy had to be interpretive, and why interpretation required a priesthood. We have not left this behind. Economic forecasting, climate projection, epidemiological modeling. Every one of them makes conditional predictions judged in hindsight and argued about afterwards. We did not abandon the practice. We professionalized it. Plenty here remains open. The oldest layer of the Bahman Yasht, how much of the Chilam Balam material predates contact, the composition date of Daniel, which the Qumran copies keep alive rather than closing. Ice core chronology continues to sharpen the 6th century picture, and imaging continues to pull text out of damaged fragments. But step back from the dating fights, and something else comes into focus. Every text on this list was written by someone whose present was close to unbearable. A Babylonian priesthood without a god, an Egyptian scribe serving a usurper, a Maya scribe writing after the books had been burned, a desert sect drafting a victory it would never see. Prophecy took the catastrophe and put it inside a plan. A scheduled disaster is survivable in a way that a random one is not. That is not stupidity. That is one of the oldest tools people have for staying functional when the world stops making sense. The Venus table is the exception that proves the rule. Real prediction existed, and it turned out to be arithmetic. The rest of them predicted the future badly and described their own moment with terrible precision, which may, in the end, be the more useful thing to have.